Happy Easter, everyone. My name is Kristen, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our online Easter services here at Great Lakes Church. First, we're going to be experiencing an encouraging time of music, so in your homes, feel free to sing along as we worship together. Next, we're going to be a part of an awesome talk by Pastor Dave about how Easter is truly a celebration for us, and more about what that means for us today. And of course, we're going to connect in the chat, so whether you're below me or beside me, feel free to share something that's on your heart. Whether there's something you're loving that you're experiencing, maybe Pastor Dave said something that really resonated with you, feel free to put that in the chat with some of your favorite emojis, and we'll connect together there. Before we kick things off with worship, just want to say again, thank you for joining us at Easter at GLC.
Till I met you, and I was breathing but not alive, and all my failures I tried to hide. There was my tomb till I met you. Called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul, and now your freedom is all that I know. When I met you, 'cause when you called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave. Sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan. Now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you call my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the dark.
And just about any moment, we should be filming the intro sequence for the Great Lakes Church online Easter service. And there you are, right on time. Happy Easter, everyone. Before I say anything else, I should step back and maintain 6 feet between us. But my name is Carson, and we are so excited that you are here today. I'm a current college senior. You may have seen me at the Kenosha campus at Great Lakes before, but if you haven't, you might have heard my voice. Yeah, that's right, if you listen to that podcast.
What is up, friends? My name is Carson, and I want to...
Yeah, yours truly. And they say I have a face for radio. I don't know what that means, but I'm gonna take it as a compliment. If we haven't met before, it's because I'm largely a part of the online community at Great Lakes, and that's due to the fact that I've been doing school in Indiana for the last 4 years. But thanks to coronavirus, I am back home and quarantining with mom and pop. Things are kicking. I am going a little crazy, and I know that because I have started running for leisure. Yeah, what kind of psychopath? If this is your first time with us at Great Lakes Church, we're gonna ask you to take a bold leap of faith. That's right. In the chat right now, you'll see a comment populate that says, hey, if this is your first time, be sure to like this comment. We're gonna ask you to throw that comment a thumbs up, just so that we can say hey, and we can say thanks for being here with us. So a little bit about us is that we're a church. Yeah, I know, groundbreaking, right? Normally we meet in 2 locations, Kenosha and Racine. But due to the madness of COVID, we're meeting in hundreds of homes across the southern Wisconsin area, and frankly, all across the US. It's a really cool opportunity to take advantage of streaming platforms like Facebook and YouTube. We're also engaging a lot of other digital mediums. So if you want to know more, you can find out everything you need to know at greatlakeschurch.com. Going into this morning, we want you to know that while a lot of things in our world are unstable and unpredictable right now, the mission of Great Lakes Church remains the same: to be people that help people find and follow Jesus. We know that Sundays look a little bit out of the ordinary. You're probably sitting on your couch in your pajama pants right now, which is an awesome change. But there's also a lot of really hard changes. And so as we uphold this mission, we want to keep you in the loop of how we're upholding this mission. And you can check it out at greatlakeschurch.com/COVID-19. If you've been an attendee of Great Lakes Church for a while now, you know that our heart is to make an impact here, near, and far. And in this season, we want to continue to serve our community and meet the needs of our church well. Your financial generosity helps us do that. So we ask you to consider linking arms with us and giving financially. You can do this right now one of 2 ways. The first way you can do this is to visit greatlakeschurch.com/give. The second way that you can give is you can pull out your cell phone right now, if you're not using it to stream church, that is, and you can text the number 74483. In the dialog box, you can put GLC space and then the number that you're prepared to give today. But you can be confident knowing that every penny that you give today goes to further the mission and the ministries of Great Lakes Church. Now, as we respect social distancing guidelines, sorry, getting a little too close for comfort, we want you to know that community isn't canceled by any means. It's important now more than ever to stay in touch with your small groups, with your volunteer teams, to find a way to serve your neighbors, and reach out to your friends and family and remind them that you love them. Whatever you're going through right now, whether it's something you want to praise God for or something you just need prayer for, we have a staff and volunteers who are committed to praying with you and serving you in this season. So if there's a prayer request or a specific need that you have, you can submit it at greatlakeschurch.com/pray. So now that you know all the basics, it is time to dive into our Easter service. So you can go ahead and warm up that cup of coffee, get your coziest hoodie out of the closet, and find somewhere to enjoy our online Easter service, because we are getting rolling and we are happy to be here celebrating Jesus' resurrection with you today. Enjoy service.
Well, hey, all you cool cats and kittens. My name is Dave, and I just want to say Happy Easter. Come on, today is going to be a great day. I know we're gathered together, we're connected online. Someday we're going to be able to be in a building, rubbing shoulders, hugging each other, spreading germs. But guys, today we are disconnected in different homes and yet connected through technology. So we are launching a series today called Jesus is King, and it is a day worth celebrating. Now, I didn't feel that way when I was a kid. I knew it was a big day, but let's just be honest. When you're a kid, Easter is a couple notches below Christmas. Christmas lasts longer. You get way better gifts. Christmas has food that tends to be better. It has cookies for several days, even weeks at a time. I mean, just a whole different story. For me, here's what Easter is summarized by. The Paz Easter egg coloring kit. You remember this thing? I'm actually surprised they're still around. I mean, these things have endured for generations, and it's so cheap, right? You've got your 9 dye tablets in this one, and you put these things in water, and it smells like someone spilled vinegar in the house. And then you have this wire, I would say torture chamber, because this is what you put the egg in, and then you lower it to its doom as you color it, knowing that someday you're going to eat it. Just absolutely ridiculous. But for me, this is kind of what summarized Easter, right? Not nearly as good as Christmas. Eggs, chocolates, Easter bunny, marshmallow demons. Some of you call them peeps, but those are the things that define it, and that's fine. As a matter of fact, if you're watching right now and there are comments happening and you're like bold enough, put your favorite Easter candy in the comments. Maybe somebody will see it and send some to you. Who knows? Put your favorite Easter candy. And if you can't think of an Easter candy, put your favorite candy in general. But I just want to make sure as we get started here, we're all on the same page. Today, Easter is not a celebration that winter is finally over. Because if you live in the Midwest where I do, it's never really over. You just don't know if it's coming to an end, right? Despite the conspiracy theories that are out there, Easter is not some holiday that Hallmark came up with or that some candy company created in order to sell more product. It just isn't. And then this is going to probably surprise some of you. Today is actually not a celebration of the teachings of Jesus or the miracles of Jesus. Easter is a celebration of Jesus rising from the dead. That's why today is such a big deal. So if you were to visit Jerusalem right now, if you were to get on a plane, go to Jerusalem, you could visit a couple different locations where scholars are going to say, hey, this is where the body of Jesus was buried. And there's 2 primary locations that are argued, right? The first of those sites is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, little side note here. Right now at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is closed because of COVID-19. And the reason that's so interesting is the first time it happened, the first time they closed it was in 1349 with the bubonic plague, and it's never been closed since. But here we are in a day and a time where it is closed. All right, so Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The other location is the Garden Tomb. And so there's debate among scholars which of these tombs was actually the tomb of Jesus. But here's the fascinating thing. Neither of those locations claim to have a physical body. Neither claim to have the ashes or the remains of Jesus. Right? Think about this. You could visit burial sites of religious leaders all around the world. In America, you could go see the burial site of Joseph Smith. You could fly to China, which you probably shouldn't do right now, the burial site of Confucius. You could go and see where the Buddha, where a monument has been set up and his remains are. You could go and fly to Saudi Arabia and see where Muhammad's resting place is. Almost every religion in this world has a resting place for its founder, but not Christianity. We don't have a resting place for the remains of Jesus because after the death of Jesus and after the burial of Jesus, he was resurrected. And the reason we even know about Jesus today, the reason that the Jesus story made it out of the first century has nothing to do with the teachings or miracles or philosophies of Jesus. It has everything to do with how, with that after the death of Jesus and the burial of Jesus, more than 500 individuals claimed to see him resurrected. Now, the Apostle Paul, who became a follower of Jesus in the first century, he writes a letter to followers of Jesus living in Corinth. And here's how he puts it. He says, Jesus was buried and he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day. He was seen by the 12 disciples. And after that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. I also saw him. In other words, he's saying to his readers, if you have any doubts, if you have any questions, get a bus ticket, go down to Jerusalem, because most of these people are still alive and they'll tell you what they saw. And that's why we're celebrating today. So for us to say, well, Easter's kind of a big deal, that is an understatement. The Apostle Paul, he writes a letter in the first century to followers of Jesus, and he puts it this way. He says, if Jesus has not been raised, then your faith is useless. Think about this. If Jesus hasn't been raised, It doesn't matter how practical your faith is. Doesn't matter how good it makes you feel. Doesn't matter if everybody believes the same thing you believe within your group of friends. If Jesus hasn't been raised, then you are building your life on a house of cards. This is crazy. It means that if someone were to find the body of Jesus, the remains of Jesus, right, and they could prove it, churches all around this world would be closing their doors the very same day. That is how big of a deal the resurrection is. Our entire faith is rooted in the resurrection. This is why Easter is so important. And I want to start by just talking about that because I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Now, over the past several years, all of us have been influenced by something called clickbait. Even if you've never heard the term, I guarantee you've been influenced by it because clickbait is a headline that sensationalizes a story in order to draw you in, right? So the purpose of the headline is to get you to click on the article and then spend as much time on the website as possible. So I'm just going to give you a few examples. I'm sure you'll recognize clickbait when you see it. All right, here's one. This outrageous truth about green gummy bears will destroy your world. You think you have life figured out, and then, bam. Well, here's the truth. I'm going to save you a few clicks here. Green gummy bears are strawberry flavored. Whoa. All right, here's another example. Why did this politician eat a breakfast burrito out of a diaper? Oh, this is crazy. All right, here's the answer. It was leaking and he did not have napkins. All right, I saved you several minutes of having to look up that article and find out why. Here we go. Here's one more example. He thought it was Bigfoot's skull, but then experts told him this. Experts always know best. You want to know what they told him? Get ready. They told him it was a rock. I mean, you could waste your time clicking through these articles, and every day we're bombarded with clickbait. And the reason I bring this up is I kind of have this feeling that Easter has become a form of clickbait for churches. Right? If you just see all the things that churches do to bring people in, it's kind of nauseating after a while. Right? I know churches all around the country, they do helicopter egg drops where they'll drop 50,000 eggs, 100,000 eggs, and they'll get big crowds. And it's kind of their way of being able to communicate the Easter story. Most churches, including ours, will do family photos or photos with the Easter bunny. Churches will do giveaways. We're going to give away a Nintendo Switch. Come hear the Easter message. $100 cash. Right? We're going to do tickets and prizes. I had a buddy of mine. This is not an exaggeration. For Easter, he was able to get more than $250,000 in donations to the church of different products. And then he did the $250,000 giveaway for his church. And they had like twice, 3 times the regular attendance. It was crazy. But churches will do anything at Easter to get people through the doors. We do carnivals and face painting. And if you've been around Great Lakes, you know I'm actually not against this stuff. All right, I like having fun. I like being creative. I always hope that our children's ministries and student ministries do fun things. But the question that I can't get away from is why does it take so much work and so much money and so much effort to communicate what is arguably the most important and potentially the biggest life-changing message of all time? I mean, if it's such a big message and has so much impact, like, why do we got to put some bells and whistles to try to get people through the door to even hear about it? Well, I'm going to give you the answer. All right, if we are honest, I think for most of us, the message of Easter has become white noise. It just is. And if it wasn't white noise, we'd wake up in the mornings, we'd be ready to take on the world. We'd have great faith and great optimism all the time. If somebody offends us, we'd be willing to forgive instantly, right? If somebody hurts us, we'd be willing to sit down and have the tough communication. We talk positive about people all the time. We would love people, serve people. We'd live life open-handed and generous. But the message of Jesus, the message specifically of Easter, has become white noise to so many of us. And it's kind of understandable, right? I mean, for one thing, our lives are busy and our lives are filled with distractions. On top of that, we live in a time period of history where if you can't prove something scientifically, you might as well dismiss it. And of course, you can't scientifically prove the resurrection. And then to top it off, for those who live in the United States, which I know is most of you who are watching, regardless of your religious background, you could probably give the Easter message, at least the summary of it. I mean, you may not have been to church in 50 years, but you could say, I know it's that Jesus died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. You've heard it from different people in different ways, different perspectives. He died, he was buried, he was resurrected. He died, he was buried, he was resurrected. And over time, what happens is that story, Jesus died, he was buried, he was resurrected. Over time, if we're honest, it just loses some of its punch, right? Some of the emotion is gone over time in a story like that. Right? When shelter in place first happened, right? Safer at home. My 14-year-old son, Jaden, he was motivated. On his own, he'd get out of bed in the morning, he'd have his checklist, he'd be doing his chores. He was ready to take on the world. But now we're a few weeks in. And earlier this week, I was looking for Jaden. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, guess where I found him? Yep, he was sleeping. He had never even gotten up. This was not a nap in the middle of the night. No, he's freaking sleeping because the motivation he had worn off. In every big event in history, from 9/11 to Pearl Harbor, we could just go back in time. All of those events eventually lose some of their emotion, some of the punch over time. And the same is true with Easter, right? Over time, what happens is we become so familiar with the story that it just loses some of the emotional attachment that we maybe at one point would have said we had. Until something happens and our world is turned upside down. Until something unfolds in our life and we don't feel safe and we don't feel comfortable and we don't feel secure anymore. Until something happens and we hit a dead end and we're desperately hoping that there is something more to this world than what we can see and taste and touch and feel. Come on, when life's going good, I think all of us, we just have this tendency to keep God at a distance, right? We tend to compartmentalize our life and not think much about God. So for those of you who are 20 years and younger, my guess is you may not have seen something that looks like this. This is called an ice cube tray. All right, so when I was growing up, and certainly generations before me, if you wanted ice, you had to put water in a tray like this, put it in freezer, and then knock it out, and you'd have ice. I think this is how a lot of us approach God, right? We have a compartment for our finances. We have a compartment for our job. We have a compartment for our relationships, our marriage, our parenting. We have a compartment for our entertainment. And then we also have a compartment somewhere for God. And maybe once a week, we go to that compartment. Or once every couple weeks, or once every couple months, or once or twice a year, we go to that compartment. It's just what we do. But here's the deal. When life's interrupted, when we no longer feel comfortable or secure, when we're starting to be plagued with different questions about life, there is something in us as humans where our hearts just become more and more open to God. Now, you would think God would be offended by that. But the truth is, God's okay with that. Like King David of Israel, he writes, "The Lord is a shelter for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble." Now, I'm not saying God wants to be a compartment, but when our hearts open up to him, that's what he's ultimately looking for. And of course, that is where our world is at right now. Maybe that's where you're at, feeling a little insecure, feeling very uncertain, feeling less than comfortable. And so if you would allow me, what I would like to briefly do is recap a story that, admittedly, for some of you is overly familiar. Not all of you, but for some of you, you could probably give this talk. Now, last week, I gave a talk and I explained how everyone in the ancient world believed that there were gods and goddesses who pretty much controlled the world. They controlled whether or not you conceived, they controlled the weather, they controlled how powerful you were, what the economy looked like, they controlled when you died. And so they would do whatever they could to keep the gods or goddesses happy. They really didn't know what God was like. Everybody was kind of guessing. And so what God decided to do was to reveal himself to the world. He said, you don't have to guess anymore. And he decided to enter our world as a human being in the flesh. That's who Jesus is. If you ever wonder what God is like, you don't have to guess. Just look at Jesus. And what's fascinating is Jesus revealed a God who looked completely different than everyone had imagined. It was a God who, quite honestly, wasn't impressed with religion or religious leaders, regardless of how disciplined they were. It was a God who loved people and accepted people regardless of how they behaved and regardless of what they were like. It's a God who elevated women and children and slaves in a world where they had no value. So Jesus coming into this world in some ways reminds me of a freelance writer by the name of Mary Ann Bird, who once wrote about her personal experience in life, and she called it the whisper test. And so Mary Ann talks about how when she was born, she had a cleft palate, and she was very embarrassed with the cleft palate because it was a time period where it wasn't easy to get surgery for something like that. She also talks about how she was partially deaf. And so she just felt different than everybody else. And of course, as she grew up and was an elementary kid, everybody made her feel different. And they mocked her and they made fun of her. And in the article, she talks about how once a year, the school that she was a part of had an annual hearing test. Just kind of what they did. And I'm sure many schools across the country at the time did something similar. What would happen is the teacher would call you to the desk, have you cover one of your ears, and then she would whisper, or he would whisper in your ear, and you had to repeat what they said. So they would say, well, the sky is blue. Or we're going to play soccer at recess. And so sure enough, Mary Ann talks about how one year she's called to the front of the classroom and she's feeling very insecure. And the teacher says, go ahead and cover your ear. They would do right ear first, left ear next, or whatever. And she said she covered her bad ear first because she just was so used to being embarrassed. She just wanted to do this right the first time. And she said the teacher whispered in her ear. And it wasn't the sky is blue. It wasn't we're going to play soccer at recess. She said what the teacher said, I'll never forget. She said, I wish you were my little girl. And she says, when my teacher said that, it started to change how I saw myself. And to this day, as she's writing the article, she says, it changed my perspective. And in many ways, that is exactly what Jesus did when he came to this planet and revealed God. He continually reminded people, you matter. You have value. You are loved. God fully accepts you. Now, John was one of the closest friends and followers of Jesus. And several decades after the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, John is looking back. He's remembering his time with Jesus. He's remembering what he saw. He's remembering his interactions. And he writes this with confidence. He says, Jesus has revealed God to us. It was a God that nobody expected. A God who wasn't angry, a God who wasn't out to get revenge, a God who did not come demanding offerings and sacrifices, but instead a God who realized that people were bringing offerings and sacrifices to make themselves feel okay with God. They were desperately trying to do what they could to feel secure. And so it's a God who flipped the script. He said, if you think offerings and sacrifices make you okay with God, well, then I'm going to be the sacrifice. And I'm going to lay my life down for you. And so this disciple, John, who at the end of his life is looking back and he's reflecting, in another one of his manuscripts, here's what he writes about Jesus. He says, Jesus himself is the sacrifice that atones for our sins. And not only our sins, but the sins of all the world. And so on a Friday afternoon, Jesus is crucified. And when he dies, all of his closest friends, his disciples, his students, they thought it was over. Because they thought Jesus was here to set up an earthly kingdom. He was going to overthrow the government. He was going to overthrow the Roman Empire. And Jesus was going to be an earthly king. And when that did not happen, and when Jesus died, his followers were devastated and they went into hiding. Now, if you know anything about world religions, you know that when a prophet dies, when a spiritual leader dies, what typically happens is their followers come together. They have a let's keep the dream alive rally. Right? They take the teachings, the philosophies, they say, how are we going to get these things into the world? Well, the followers of Jesus didn't do that because so many of the teachings of Jesus were about him. And they pointed to who he was. And so when he died, his followers instantly lost hope. And then a couple days after his death, it was a Sunday morning, there was a handful of women who went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus with spices. Right? This was very customary. Right? They would bring spices to put on the body to help with the smell of decomposition, because you know this, that a dead body smells a lot like a middle school boy's locker room. I mean, so they're saying, hey, we're going to practice custom, we're going to do that. And the fact they're bringing these spices tell you they were not anticipating a resurrection. And so these women are the very first people to notice that Jesus' body is missing. He's not there. So what do you think they did? Well, they did the same thing we would do, right? They panicked. They ran and they found disciples of Jesus who were hiding out in the house, and they tell the disciples about their experience. And here's just one account of how the disciples responded to that story. But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. I love this, right? To me, this is just so raw. Of course, they didn't believe it because they had seen Jesus die. But eventually, their curiosity is piqued, and two of the disciples, they get up and they run to the tomb to see what these women are talking about. Those two disciples were Peter and John. Now, John writes an account about what happened. And it's so fascinating because you read this account and he actually refers to himself in an odd way. It's kind of like the third person. He calls himself the other disciple. He could have just said John, but he says the other disciple. Here's what he writes. He says, so Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Hey, time out. John wants you to know he was faster than Peter. Right? He was a better runner. You just don't miss that. So John bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him because he was slower than John, and he went straight into the tomb. So hold on. John won't go in. Why? Because he's like the rest of us. He's kind of afraid. He's dark inside that tomb. He doesn't know what's there. But Peter is crazy impulsive. You see this through his whole life. He acts and then he thinks later. And so Peter runs in the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, right? He was faster. He also went inside. He saw and believed. So initially, all Peter and John see is an empty tomb. They don't have a supernatural experience. That happens a few days later when they see the resurrected Jesus firsthand. But this experience marks them. And because of this experience, the Jesus movement launches overnight. Now, I'm just going to pause real quickly and say this. If you find yourself cynical, if you find yourself very much doubting that a dead man came back to life, nobody's going to fault you. I get it. I understand that. Two simple resources I would point you to. You could go to Amazon, and there is a book written by a guy named Lee Strobel. It's called The Case for Easter. I'd highly recommend it. All right. Lee Strobel was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune back in the 1980s. He did a story on the resurrection of Jesus. He was an atheist, but while doing the story and doing all this investigation, he actually became a follower of Jesus. It was that convincing to him. If you don't like to read, I totally understand. There is a movie right now on Netflix. It's called The Case for Christ. And it's actually a really, really well done movie. It is the story of Lee Strobel becoming a follower of Jesus. I'd recommend it, The Case for Christ. But one of the greatest proofs we have for the resurrection is how many witnesses, hundreds and hundreds of eyewitnesses to the resurrection, resurrected Jesus. And of course, they did exactly what you and I would do if we had seen someone die, if they were buried, and now we saw them walking around several days later. We saw a resurrected Jesus. They talked about it. They wrote about it. It was a first century social media storm. And there were so many people talking about it, so many eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus, that unlike other religions that kind of evolved slowly over the years, Christianity just exploded overnight. Thousands and thousands of people left their traditional religion, Judaism, to become followers of Jesus. It was completely unheard of. And then just to be clear, the people leading this Jesus movement, they weren't getting wealthy off of it. They weren't being launched into celebrity status, right? They weren't given great power because of it within government and the different structures that were set. The Roman government actually wanted to put an end to all of this. And so they were persecuting, they were killing people who claimed to be eyewitnesses to the resurrection. They wanted to stop what was going on. And what's crazy is all they would need to have done in that time period is just produce a body. They knew where the body of Jesus had been buried, but there was no body there. And a few weeks after the resurrection, Peter and John, who had kind of emerged as like the strong leaders in this Jesus movement, just from the earliest days, They were talking about Jesus. They were talking about the resurrection in very public forums. And when they were confronted and when they were threatened by the political and religious leaders for what they were saying, here was their response. This is fascinating. They said, we cannot stop telling about everything we have seen and heard. That was it. We can't stop talking about what we've seen and heard, not what we believe, not what somebody told us, not what we read, but what we have seen and heard. Now, I want you to think about this. A group of guys who a few weeks earlier are hiding out in a house, the disciples. They see the resurrected Jesus, and what happens is they go and they turn the world upside down. These men who initially lie about their connection with Jesus because they don't want to get themselves in trouble, these same men go out and they change the world, and eventually every single one of them die. Not because of something they read, not because of something they heard, but because they said they saw a dead man walking again, and they would not recant from their story, despite the fact that they were killed because of it. And so today is not a celebration of the Easter Bunny. It's not a celebration of the miracles of Jesus or the teachings of Jesus. It is a celebration of an event that happened in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And for followers of Jesus, everything we are, guys, everything we believe hinges on this singular event, the resurrection. But the question I'm obsessed with, right? The question I cannot get away from is, why does it matter so much? Going back to what we read earlier, the Apostle Paul writes, if Jesus has not been raised, then your faith is useless. If Jesus is dead, then everything we believe and everything we do because of our beliefs, it's worthless. It's based on a lie. If the way you parent is different, if the way you do marriage is different, if the way you work is different, if the way you choose to handle conflict is different, if there's anything different about your life that you can point to, you say, this is different because I believe in a living God. Paul says, hey, I'm glad you're different. But it's rooted in a lie. Guys, this is so important because all throughout human history, people have altered their lives and they've sacrificed and they've made decisions they wouldn't normally make because their faith is rooted in a living God. So why does the resurrection matter? Well, there's hundreds of reasons it matters. Let me give you two big ones. Number one, the resurrection answers the question of who Jesus is. Jesus is the most important figure of all time. I don't think anybody's going to argue that. Right? History is divided. You just look at any calendar. Every time you write a date, it is divided before Jesus and after Jesus. And so the most important question that any of us can answer is the one that Jesus asked his disciples 2,000 years ago. Who do you say that I am? Well, if Jesus would have died and if he would have stayed dead, it'd be really hard to believe that he was God. It'd be really hard to believe that he had the power to forgive sins. Right? So think of it this way. You go to Costco, you go to Sam's Club. When you leave, you have to do what? You have to show them a receipt. And they kind of do a quick scan. They look at what's in your cart and they check it off. So I want you to try to think of Easter as a receipt. So Jesus purchases our freedom. He purchases our forgiveness on the cross. But the resurrection validates it. The resurrection is the proof of purchase. It's the receipt that says Jesus actually had the power to do what he said he was doing. The resurrection tells us that Jesus was more than a role model. He was more than a teacher. He was more than a philosopher. He was more than a miracle worker or a revolutionary. The resurrection tells us Jesus really was God, which means we don't have to have ambiguity. We don't have to have confusion over what God is like or who God is. All we need to do is look at Jesus. That's the first implication. The second one is this. The resurrection is not just some physical event that happened. The resurrection is something that you and I are invited to participate in. So what happened to Jesus physically in the death and resurrection is the very same thing that happens spiritually when we become followers of Jesus. Our old life dies. It's buried and we're risen to something new. So over the last few decades, I've met literally thousands of people who in different forms have said this, right? They've said it in different ways, but they've said, I at one point was consumed with selfishness. I was consumed by jealousy. I was driven by my selfish desires. I thought only about myself. I lived in fear all the time. I was anxious all the time. Everybody's kind of got their story of what they were, but they said, my life has been changed by Jesus. Who I was died, who I was has been buried. And the Apostle Paul, in one of the many, many letters he wrote in the first century, he references his old life. It was a life that was marked by self-righteousness. And here's what he says about it. He says, my old self has been crucified with Christ. He says, I died to the pride and the striving and the greed and the power and the control and the self-righteousness that defined my life when my life was all about me. In another letter he writes, he goes a step further and he speaks very candidly to every follower of Jesus. He says, the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. And just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, he will give life to your mortal bodies by this same Spirit living within you. Paul says, I haven't just died to self-righteousness. I've been risen to something incredible. I've been risen to humility. I've been risen to a life of selflessness. And if you know anything about the story of Paul and his life, after his conversion, he spent the rest of his time on this planet continuing the work of Jesus. Do not miss this. The work of Jesus did not stop with the disciples. It did not stop with the first eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. It did not stop with the Apostle Paul. The work of Jesus, the movement of Jesus, has continued throughout the centuries as people have experienced firsthand the reality of what it means to die to their old self and be risen to something new. And if you know anything about church history, and anything about history, not just church history, it's the followers of Jesus who've led the way in building hospitals and orphanages and schools. Followers of Jesus have been the first to respond to crisis and feeding the hungry and bringing clean drinking water to those who need it, bringing the message of God's love to people all around the world by serving. Now, if this is your first interaction with Great Lakes, and this is the first time maybe you've ever heard me speak, I know you're probably thinking, dude, is this guy hyped up on energy drinks all the time? And the answer is yes, right? I have energy. But you probably figured out by now, we're not a traditional church. And not just because we're doing stuff online, but we don't have a bunch of liturgy, and we don't have these very old architectural buildings with stained glass windows. That being said, I love stained glass windows. And there's a church in Leawood, Kansas. It's called the Church of the Resurrection that has one of the most fascinating stained glass windows I've ever seen. It's roughly the size of a basketball court. So this thing is massive. And what makes it fascinating is it doesn't just feature individuals that we read about in the Bible or saints from hundreds of years ago. It actually features men and women from the past 100 years. It features Mother Teresa caring for someone dying in Calcutta. It features Emmett and Mamie Till. Emmett's death, you might remember, sparked the modern day civil rights movement. It features Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor who died in a Nazi concentration camp. Pope John the 23rd, Billy Graham, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. And you know what all these people are doing? They're continuing the work of Jesus that was started by individuals who are resurrected, or who are eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. They're participating in the resurrection story. So, every time someone repents and gets forgiven, every time an addict steps from the shadows and gets help, every time racial reconciliation happens, every time someone commits themselves to being generous, every time a marriage is healed, every time we celebrate children in foster care, every time we paint bowls to raise money to help the homeless, every time we make shoes for individuals living in remote parts of Uganda, every time we help girls living in Eswatini, Africa, every time we serve those in the special needs community, every time we welcome children and students through our doors and prioritize them, we are participating in the resurrection. We are dying to ourselves and being resurrected to something bigger. And I don't know what your life story is, but here's what I know. It's possible to die to a life of hostility and be resurrected to a life of peace. It's possible to die to a life of insecurity and be raised to a life of confidence, to die to fear and be raised to courage. Die to hate, be resurrected to love. Die to a life where you have to hide all the time, be resurrected to a point where you're comfortable and confident in sharing your weaknesses. You can participate in the resurrection story, but you have to die first. You have to decide, my life's not going to be about me. You have to decide, I can't fix myself. My kingdom isn't what matters most. And I know so many of you have done that over the years, but if you've never done that, I invite you, as I pray here in just a moment, to just in your heart with maybe not even saying anything out loud, just to say, I believe and I want to follow Jesus. Let me pray for you. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And our prayer today is that for those who for the very first time want to become your followers, that today would be a day that marks them. And that all of us on a regular basis would experience the power of what it is to die to our old self and have it buried and be resurrected to something new. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you for taking time to join us to celebrate Easter. If you felt like this message was something that maybe someone else needed to hear, I'd encourage you, go ahead and share it. And maybe call someone, say, I'm going to email you this message. But I really encourage you to do that if you think of someone who could benefit from it. Next week, we are going to unpack what it means for Jesus to be the King of our life. And I hope that you are going to join us. If you want to stick around here for a moment, we have one more song for you. Maybe you have some food around and a drink, and you just want to take this as a time of reflection and communion. I will leave that up for you to decide. Happy Easter. Thanks for joining us.
My heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. 'Cause you are good. You're good. Oh, 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 let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song. The King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, it's my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the anchor of my days. Oh, he is my song. 'Cause you are good. You're good. Oh, you are good. You're good. Oh, you are good. You're good. Oh, you are good. You're good. Oh.
And you're never gonna let me down. 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 You're never gonna let me